Welcome to Rome After Dark. Welcome back to boring history for sleep. Tonight, we're heading to ancient Rome, but not the version from school books or movies with grand speeches and marble statues. Nope. This is Rome after dark. Let's get cozy, get under the blankets, and talk about something the Romans were really into. Sex. Not in a scandalous way, in a historical way. Okay, a little scandalous. But mostly chill, promise, because here's the thing. Ancient Rome had no filters. The walls of their cities were basically ancient Twitter, full of graffiti about who did what with whom and how it was. The Romans didn't shy away from talking about sex. They wrote about it, joked about it, prayed about it, and even made little clay statues of it. Seriously, you couldn't walk 5 feet in Pompeii without seeing a phallic symbol carved into a wall. They were everywhere, but let's not rush. First, a little background to set the mood. The city that never slept and never blushed. Rome wasn't just a city. It was an empire, massive, messy, and full of contradictions. By the 1st century BCE, it had grown from a scrappy city-state into a sprawling beast, stretching from Britain to Egypt. With that kind of scale came all sorts of people, languages, beliefs, and, yes, bedroom habits. And unlike modern cultures, where sex is often whispered about or hidden behind locked doors, the Romans talked about it like they were discussing the weather. To them, it was just part of daily life. No shame, no secrecy, just there. But don't get the wrong idea. They weren't exactly free love hippies either. Sex in Rome came with rules, lots of them. Who could do what, to whom, and how. All of that depended on class, gender, and power. So while Rome might have looked sexually open on the surface, underneath it was all about control. Sex equals power, not just pleasure. Let's get this straight, pun mildly intended. For Romans, sex wasn't just about pleasure, it was about dominance. Roman men were expected to be the active ones, not just in bed, but in society. They conquered lands, gave speeches, and, well, conquered other things. To be manly meant being in charge, and that extended to the bedroom. Being the dominant partner, regardless of gender, was totally fine. But being the passive one, that could hurt your reputation. Especially if you were a free Roman male, it was seen as unmanly, even weak. So already, you can see, Roman sexuality wasn't a free-for-all, it had social boundaries. And stepping outside them could mean mockery, shame, or worse, marriage wasn't the endgame. You might think the Romans, like us, link sex closely with love and marriage. Not really. For most Roman men, marriage was more about politics, property, and producing legitimate children, preferably sons. Romantic love, that was something you maybe found with a mistress, a lover, or a poet's fantasy. Upper-class marriages were arranged early and often loveless. Some couples did grow close, but affection wasn't required. A good Roman wife was supposed to be loyal, obedient, and respectable, but passion, that was someone else's department. And Roman women, their roles were complicated. We'll dive into that more in later chapters. But for now, know this. The freedom to enjoy sex or not was deeply tied to your status in society. And for women, that status was tightly policed. Public spaces, private desires. Let's talk brothels, because they weren't tucked away or hidden in dark alleys. In Roman cities, you could find brothels near bakeries, bathhouses, and temples. Sometimes they even shared a wall. These weren't luxurious spaces. Think cramped rooms with stone beds, no windows, and graffiti carved into the walls, but they were busy and legal. Sex work was not just accepted, it was regulated. And here's the wild part. Some brothels actually had menus, wall paintings showing different sexual acts with prices listed. No guesswork required. Of course, not everyone working there was doing it willingly. Many sex workers were enslaved, which is heavy and tragic, but also important to understand because it shows how tied sex was to power in Rome, not just personal, but political. Dirty jokes. Clean conscience Romans loved a good joke, especially the dirty kind. You'll find graffiti in Pompeii like, "Successus the weaver loves Iris, the slave of the innkeeper. She doesn't care about him." Or, "I screwed the barmaid." Okay, not exactly Shakespeare, but it tells us a lot. These weren't famous authors. They were everyday people leaving behind very human thoughts, crushes, boasts, heartbreak, hookups, all scribbled on a wall like ancient post-its. In a way, it's comforting. The past wasn't made up of statues and senators. It was made of awkward flirting, bad pickup lines, and relationship drama. Why this even matters? So why are we talking about this? Why peek into Rome's bedroom instead of its battlefields? Because how a society views sex tells us a lot about what it values and what it fears. In Rome, sex wasn't just a physical act. It was a statement, a way of asserting power, keeping social order, and defining who mattered. And even though they were wildly open about it, they were also deeply judgmental, not based on who you loved, but how you did it, and where you stood in the pecking order. So tonight, we're not just gossiping about emperors and orgies, though don't worry, there will be emperors and orgies. We're uncovering how the Romans saw themselves and each other, love, lust, and Latin, a Roman romance primer. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Last night, we tiptoed into ancient Rome's bedroom, got a glimpse of their very open, very structured take on sex. But tonight, we're shifting gears. Just a little. We're going to talk about love. Not modern love. Not notebook throwing, heart eyes emoji, serenade under the window kind of love. Roman love was different, messier, more poetic, a little transactional, and sometimes surprisingly sweet. So let's dim the lights and curl up, because tonight we're diving into the Roman heart. Love wasn't the goal, but lust definitely was. First thing to know, Romans didn't really believe in true love the way we do now. You weren't expected to marry for it. You didn't chase it your whole life. You didn't go on 73 bad Tinder dates hoping to find a. Marriage was about alliances, politics, and producing kids, preferably sons, the whole falling in love and growing old together thing. That was not the standard storyline, but lust, desire, obsession. Oh, that the Romans understood. In fact, they had a whole vocabulary for different kinds of love. The kind that burns, the kind that haunts you, the kind that drives you to write dramatic poetry even though you're a full-grown senator with a beard and a voting record. Let's talk about words. The Latin kind. The Latin language is incredibly specific when it comes to love and desire. Here are just a few flavors of it. Amor, love. This is your basic, general love. Can be romantic or not. Think, I love my dog or I love wine. Libido, desire, lust, appetite. Ra, hungry, physical. Cupida, intense longing. Also the name of the god who liked to shoot arrows at people and cause chaos. Venus, not just a goddess. Also used to mean charm, seduction, sensuality. The Romans weren't confused about what kind of feelings they were having. They had a word for each one. And sometimes, all those feelings hit at once. Especially when poets got involved. The drama, kings of ancient lovelets talk about Roman poets. These were not chill people. They were the write 17 angry love poems and still send flowers type. One of the biggest names was Ovid, the original romance and heartbreak influencer. He wrote Amores, which means the loves, full of steamy verses and messy relationships. But his real masterpiece was Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, basically an ancient guide to dating, seducing, and ghosting. Ovid gave tips like, go to the races or the theater to meet cute strangers. Compliment them, but don't overdo it. Know when to push, when to pull back. Use poetry. Always use poetry. Imagine a self-help book written in verse by someone who's been dumped 12 times and still thinks he's a catch. That's Ovid, and people loved it. For a while, anyway, until Emperor Augustus read it and went, this feels like the opposite of family values. He wasn't wrong. Ovid's work got him exiled, but we'll save that for another chapter. Marriage. More contract than connection as mentioned. Most Roman marriages weren't about love. They were arranged, often when the bride was still a teenager. The groom could be much older. The whole thing was more legal than emotional. Marriage contracts spelled out dowries, responsibilities, and expectations. Love letters, not included. That said, not every marriage was cold or distant. Some couples grew to like or even love each other. But that was a bonus, not a requirement, and even within marriage, passion was often considered, well, suspicious. Too much desire was seen as undignified. A good Roman man was supposed to be in control of himself, of his wife, of his urges. So, naturally, that meant extramarital passion was the outlet for many. Courtesans, mistresses, and muse types. Where did Roman men look for romance? Often outside the home. Wealthy men might have mistresses, lovers, or favored companions who were courtesans, educated, witty, and trained in the art of conversation. These weren't street-level sex workers. They were often skilled entertainers, musicians, and artists. Think of them as the romantic it girls of the Roman elite, except they weren't free women, and their safety depended on staying in favor. Poets especially loved writing about these women. Whether they existed or were fictional is still up for debate. But characters like Lesbia, Catulus's muse, or Corinna, Ovid's flame, were portrayed as passionate, fickle, independent, and infuriatingly irresistible. In those poems, you see a glimpse of something close to modern romantic obsession. Jealousy, heartbreak, euphoria, despair, the whole messy ride. Same-sex desire. Totally normal. Mostly Rome had room for all kinds of relationships, as long as certain power structures were kept in place. Same-sex relationships, especially between men, were common and often accepted. Poets like Martial and Juvenal wrote openly about them, sometimes lovingly, sometimes mockingly. The key rule: social status. A Roman citizen man could sleep with another man, but only if he was the dominant partner, usually with a younger or lower status male. Love between women, harder to track, but there are whispers of it in art, inscriptions, and the occasional scandal. Mostly, though, women's sexuality was ignored by the official record unless it involved men. Still, it's safe to say that Rome had a much broader spectrum of relationships than many later societies would allow. Love spells and heartbreak charmserments in Rome wasn't all poems and passion. Sometimes it got weird. People believed in love magic. They'd carve spells into lead tablets and bury them in graves to win someone's affection. Or curse a rival. You might find a message like, bind her, drive her mad with love for me, make her burn, day and night. Nice. Others made potions, using herbs, animal parts, or much worse, to inspire lust or fidelity. Roman love, in this sense, could be a little creepy, but again, it shows how intense those feelings were. Love might not have been expected in marriage, but when it hit hard. The Roman heart, messy but familiar. So, what can we say about Roman love? It wasn't hearts and flowers. It was a battlefield of pride, poetry, control, and desire. It didn't always lead to happy endings. In fact, it usually didn't. But it was real, messy, sometimes sweet, often ridiculous. And somehow familiar. Because, even though 2,000 years have passed, and our dating apps don't involve cursing rivals with lead tablets, hopefully, people are still people. We still write awkward texts, we still fall too fast. We still try to play it cool when we're anything but. The Patriarch's Bedroom, Power and Pleasure. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. So far, we've tiptoed through the alleys of ancient desire and peeked at Rome's rather complicated love life. Tonight, we're slipping into the bedroom of the Roman man, or more specifically, the paterfamilias, the patriarch of the household. Now, this isn't just some guy in a tunic. The Roman father had serious authority. He wasn't just the head of the family, he was the law, at least inside his own home, and that power, it extended to almost everything, even to who was allowed to enjoy what, and with whom. So get comfortable. We're entering the world of power, pleasure, and some pretty intense double standards. The ideal Roman man to be a man in ancient Rome wasn't just about having a beard and a job. It meant living up to a certain image, one that was bold, in control, and never, ever submissive. The Roman ideal man, especially if he was a citizen, was expected to be active in all things, and yes, that includes the bedroom, rational and disciplined, always the one in charge. Was supposed to conquer in war, in politics, and in private life, even in relationships. The Roman man was not just a lover, he was a commander, and just to be clear, that doesn't mean he had to be faithful. Fidelity, what it really expected of Roman men, not to their wives, at least. The power of the paterfamily paterfamilias had total authority over his household, wife, children, slaves, and even adult sons if they still lived at home. He could arrange marriages, approve divorces, discipline anyone, and control the family finances. And yes, he could also control who slept with whom, especially when it came to enslaved people in the house. That part's hard to hear, but it was the reality. Enslaved people had no legal rights, which meant they couldn't give or withhold consent. If the paterfamilias wanted something, it was considered his right to take it. Again, not fun to talk about, but it's important to understand how deeply tied sex was to status and control in Roman life. The masculine role in sex. So, what did being a man mean when it came to sex? For Romans, it meant being the active partner. That was the core idea. Whether a man was with a woman, another man, or an enslaved person, it didn't really matter, as long as he was the one doing the action. Being on the receiving end of sex was considered unmanly, unless you were a woman, a slave, or someone lower on the social ladder. A freeborn male citizen, especially an elite one, was expected to be dominant, always. That's why Romans had such strong opinions about same-sex relationships, not because they were against them, but because roles mattered. A man sleeping with another man? Fine, if the second man was younger, lower class, or enslaved. But if a freeborn Roman man was the passive partner, that was scandalous. Not illegal, but humiliating. Sex as social statement in Rome. Sex wasn't just a personal act, it was a performance of social rank. Think of it this way. Every time a man chose a sexual partner, he was making a statement. He was saying, I'm the one in charge here. This person, whether woman, man, or slave, is beneath me in status. That might sound cold, but that's how Rome worked. Sex wasn't just about pleasure. It was about position, literally and figuratively, and this attitude showed up everywhere, in law, in art, and in dirty graffiti scratched onto the walls of taverns. What about women? Ah yes, the Roman wife, while her husband might be out chasing mistresses or dropping coins at the local brothel, she was expected to be the picture of virtue, loyal, modest, quiet, and definitely not sleeping around. In fact, a Roman woman caught cheating could be divorced instantly and sometimes punished severely. But her husband, he could brag about his escapades, write poems about them, and no one batted an eye. Double standards. Big time. But it wasn't just about control, it was about reputation. A Roman man's honor was tied to how well he controlled his household. If his wife stepped out of line, he looked weak. So her behavior reflected on his status. The bedroom. As a battlefield, you might think that once the bedroom door was closed, things would even out. But for Romans, even sex inside marriage was shaped by power. A husband was expected to initiate, a wife expected to comply. That's not to say every marriage was cold or cruel. Many couples likely found affection, laughter, even desire. But the cultural expectation was clear. The man was in charge, always. Even Roman love poetry, which seems soft and romantic at first glance, is full of domination, jealousy, and control. The lover wants to possess the beloved, not just kiss them under the moonlight. Famous and infamous example. Let's look at a couple of real Roman patriarchs and what they got up to. Cato the Elder was the poster boy for Roman virtue. He believed in strict discipline, simple living, and moral order. He supposedly only slept with his wife to make babies, and felt guilty if it was for pleasure. So, not exactly a romantic, Julius Caesar, on the other hand, had a more colorful reputation. Known for his affairs with both women and men, he was once nicknamed every woman's husband and every man's wife. Ouch. Even in his powerful position, being called passive was still a deep insult. And then there's Cicero, who couldn't stop complaining about how corrupt and lustful other men were, even though he himself wrote some pretty steamy love letters in his youth. Reputation was everything in the end. All of this obsession with dominance and control came down to one thing: reputation. A Roman man could do a lot: cheat, flirt, brag, write poetry about his ex, as long as he didn't look weak. That meant staying in control of his desires, his household, and his public image. Lose that control, and you might as well lose your toga, too. Women's lives between the sheets. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. So far, we've talked about the Roman man, big tunic energy, head of the household, master of everything, including the bedroom schedule. But tonight, we're stepping into the world of Roman women. Their lives were complicated, especially when it came to sex. On paper, they had very few rights. But between the sheets and behind the scenes, Roman women weren't always as passive or powerless as they seemed. So fluff your pillow, take a breath, and let's meet the wives, mistresses, rule breakers, and rebels of ancient Rome. The ideal Roman woman and why she rarely existed. The official image of a proper Roman woman was simple, quiet, modest, obedient, and loyal to her husband. She was expected to get married often young, have children, preferably boys, stay out of the public eye, definitely not flirt with gladiators. In other words, she was supposed to be the human version of a locked jewelry box. Pretty, valuable, but not too loud, and definitely not opened without permission. But as with most things in Rome, the real story was much messier. Marriage, a legal contract, not a love story. Most Roman women didn't choose their husbands. Marriages were arranged by families, often when the bride was still a teenager, somewhere as young as 12 or 13. The main goal: children and property connections. If love showed up later, great. But it wasn't required. Legally, women were often transferred from the authority of their father paterfamilias to their husband, like a ceremonial handoff. In earlier Roman times, this was pretty strict. Once you were married, your husband basically owned your legal identity. Later on, though, women began to gain more independence, especially wealthy ones. Some remained under their father's authority even after marriage, giving them more control over their own property. That loophole became very useful. Expectations in the bedroom. In theory, Roman wives were expected to have sex only with their husbands, and only for the purpose of having children. Passion, not really part of the official job description. If a wife was too sexy, too flirtatious, or, heaven forbid, showed signs of enjoying herself too much, people got suspicious, because in Roman society, a good woman was supposed to be reserved, controlled, almost invisible in matters of desire. But of course, that's not the whole story. Women who broke the mold. Some Roman women refused to play by the rules. Take Clodia, for example, the sister of the powerful politician Clodius Pulcher. She was wealthy, well-educated, bold, and had a habit of collecting lovers like wine goblets. The poet Catullus was madly in love with her. In his poems, she appears as Lesbia, a passionate, clever woman who broke his heart multiple times. Was she scandalous? Yes. Was she fascinating? Absolutely. Then there was Julia, the daughter of Emperor Augustus. He tried to push strict moral laws onto Roman society, including limits on adultery. Ironically, Julia became famous for her affairs with poets, senators, and pretty much whoever caught her eye. Eventually, Augustus exiled her for embarrassing the imperial family. In both cases, these women were seen as dangerous, not because of violence or politics, but because of sex. Courtesans and high-class companions. Not every woman in Roman society was expected to be a modest wife. Some carved out space in more flexible roles, like the meretrix or courtesan. Courtesans were often well-educated, charming, and trained in the art of conversation. They were companions to rich men, offering not just sex, but wit, music, and sometimes even political advice. Think of them as the unofficial therapists of Roman elite society, just with more eyeliner. They weren't considered respectable, but they weren't considered low class either. And some gained real power, simply by being close to powerful men. Still, their freedom came with limits. Most were enslaved or formerly enslaved, and even the most successful courtesans could be tossed aside at any moment. The lower rungs, servants and slaves. Now, we need to talk about the darker side of things. In many Roman households, enslaved women were part of the domestic staff, and they were vulnerable, often used for sex by the male head of the household or his sons. It wasn't considered a crime. It wasn't even considered scandalous. These women had no legal protection, no say, and no escape. It's a sobering truth. A huge part of Roman sexual culture was built on the idea that some bodies didn't deserve autonomy. Even worse, these acts weren't always hidden. They were seen as a man's right, a quiet, brutal part of everyday life. Women and adultery, a dangerous game when it came to cheating. The double standards were wild. Men could visit brothels, keep mistresses, and brag about it at dinner. But if a woman strayed, even once, she could face divorce, exile, or worse. Adultery wasn't just a moral offense, it was a crime, especially after Emperor Augustus passed his morality laws. Roman law even allowed a father to kill his daughter and her lover if he caught them in the act. The husband didn't have that right, oddly enough, but he was expected to divorce her or risk legal trouble himself. It all came down to control. A woman's sexuality was tied to family honor. Any hint that she wasn't pure brought shame, not just on her, but on her entire household. But not all was gloom, that said. Not every Roman woman was miserable or repressed. Some formed strong emotional bonds with their husbands. Some became wealthy widows who ran estates and called the shots. Some outlived their husbands and finally got to do whatever they wanted. And let's not forget the power of letters, poetry, and gossip. Women wrote, spoke, and whispered. Even if history didn't always record their voices, if you read between the lines, in love poems, in legal cases, in tombstones, you can see flickers of joy, resistance, and even cheeky rebellion. Her side of the story. So, what do we take from all this? Roman women lived under strict rules, but they found ways to bend, twist, and sometimes break them. They navigated a world that demanded silence, but they still made noise. Through lovers, through poems, through sheer stubborn survival, their experiences were shaped by class, age, and fate. But their desires, dreams, and frustrations, those were human, universal, sometimes tragic, sometimes funny, always real. Prostitutes, brothels, and street life. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. So far, we've explored the bedrooms of elite Romans, the poets, the patriarchs, the wives, the rebels. But tonight, we're stepping outside, into the alleys, taverns, and shadowy corners of the Eternal City. Because in ancient Rome, sex wasn't just happening behind closed doors. It was a business, loud, legal, and literally carved into stone walls. So wrap yourself in a warm blanket and come along as we take a sleepy, scandalous stroll down the red light district of the ancient world. Legal, labeled, and licensed. Here's something that might surprise you. Prostitution in ancient Rome was 100% legal. No shame, no sneaking around. In fact, prostitutes were required to register with the local authorities. Once they did, they were officially labeled as infames, a legal status that meant you were outside the bounds of Roman respectability. It wasn't a secret life. It was a profession, regulated, taxed, and tracked. Did it come with rights? Not really, but Rome didn't try to hide it. Quite the opposite. It advertised brothels, cramped, busy, and covered in graffiti. Roman brothels, called lupanaria, were everywhere. Archaeologists have identified dozens of them in cities like Pompeii, and most were shockingly tiny. Picture this, a narrow hallway with little rooms off to the sides. Each room had a stone bed built into the wall, maybe a thin mat on top, if you were lucky. No windows, no privacy, and on the walls, paintings of different sexual positions, kind of like a menu with pictures. And no, the paintings weren't subtle. Some brothels even carved prices right into the plaster. One inscription in Pompeii reads, 2 asses for the girl from Greece, a coin. not a donkey. Though Rome being Rome, who knows, it was transactional, quick, and often very public. Who were the workers? Most sex workers in Rome were enslaved. They didn't get to choose the job, or quit it. Many were brought in from faraway provinces, trained, renamed, and forced to serve in brothels or private homes. Others were freed women, former slaves who stayed in the trade because it was all they knew, or because it paid better than washing laundry or selling olives in the Forum. There were also a few independent prostitutes, usually older, street smart, and working without a pimp or brothel. They might hang out near taverns, baths, or busy markets. Some carried little signs or wore colorful clothes to stand out. But regardless of status, all of them had one thing in common. Once you became infamous, your social rights were basically gone. Who were the clients? Everyone. Okay, not literally everyone, but let's just say that brothels had a steady stream of customers: soldiers, merchants, slaves, politicians, teenage boys, even married men sneaking out between Senate debates. There wasn't much stigma. For men visiting prostitutes, it was seen as normal, even healthy. A way to keep your urges under control without disturbing your wife, who was supposed to be pure and proper and not into that kind of thing. There were even Roman doctors who recommended brothel visits as a kind of ancient stress relief. Your HMO would not cover it today. The streetwalkers and alley girls knit every sex worker had a roof over her head. Many worked the streets, especially in big cities like Rome and Ostia. These women were known as noctilucae, or night lights, because they often carried lanterns to attract attention. They worked near taverns, under balconies, or outside the city gates. The job was riskier, rougher, and less predictable than brothel work, but it also came with more freedom, at least in choosing where to stand. Some even had regular clients, forming semi-stable arrangements, still without legal protections or citizenship. They lived on the edge of Roman society, advertising the ancient way. Rome didn't have billboards or flyers, but it did have graffiti, lots of it. On the walls of Pompeii, you'll find messages like, "I screwed the barmaid. Maritimus had 10 girls here. At Nisha's place, the girls are hot and the wine is cold." Some are just bragging, others are directions, arrows pointing the way to nearby brothels. It's like Yelp reviews carved into stone. With less tact. And sometimes, the sex workers wrote back, leaving their own names, insults, or warnings for future visitors, like, "Don't try to kiss me unless you pay." Fair. The role of gender. While most Roman sex workers were women, they were also male prostitutes. Some catered to women, others to men. Like everything else in Rome, the key issue was status, not gender. A male sex worker could serve female clients, often wealthy widows or bored noble women, but more commonly, they served male clients who wanted to be the dominant partner. Passive male sex workers were often mocked, but not outlawed. Again, Rome didn't care what you did, just who was in charge. The religion of it, I'll believe it or not. There was also a spiritual side to sex work in some parts of the empire, especially older regions influenced by Greek or Eastern customs. Temple prostitution was a thing. Worshippers of goddesses like Venus or Isis might offer sexual acts at a kind of ritual service. In Rome itself, this wasn't common, but Venus, the goddess of love, sex, and beauty, was still a powerful symbol, and many brothels had little statues of her in the corner, as if asking for divine protection during business hours. It's a strange blend of sacred and sleazy. But welcome to ancient Rome. Did they have protection? Sort of. Roman doctors and herbalists wrote about birth control, including pessaries, herbs, and ancient condoms made from linen or animal intestines. None of it was super reliable. But sex workers knew their trade, and they used whatever tools they had to stay safe, physically and financially. As for stis, Romans knew about them too. They had names for various down their problems and made lotions and potions to treat them. Some ingredients included vinegar, honey, and crocodile dung. We do not recommend the last one. Life on the margin. Sex work in ancient Rome was a paradox. It was everywhere, accepted, legal, even advertised, but the people doing it were still considered outcasts. They could be used, but not respected, paid, but never honored. And yet, their voices echo across time, scratched into walls, whispered in poems, and frozen in paintings. They were part of the city's heartbeat, whether history chose to celebrate them or not. The art of seduction, according to Ovid. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. So far, we've peeked into bedrooms and brothels, but tonight, we're slowing things down a bit. We're not jumping straight into the action. We're watching the build-up, the looks, the smiles, the ancient equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs, but with a wax tablet and maybe a toga that's just a little looser than usual, because tonight we're learning the art of seduction, and not just from any Roman, from the one who practically wrote the manual. Ovid. So lie back, relax, and prepare for some ancient flirting tips, awkward date advice, and yes, a few poetic pickup lines that definitely did not age well. Meet Ovid, Rome's resident romance guru. Publius Ovidius Naso, or Just Ovid, was one of Rome's most famous poets. He lived during the reign of Emperor Augustus, right at that delicate moment when Rome was trying to clean up its image with some good old-fashioned morality laws. Ovid did not help with that. He wrote about love, desire, affairs, and everything in between. His most scandalous work was Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, basically a 3-part guide to seduction, with advice for both men and women, and it wasn't subtle. Where Augustus was saying, let's promote traditional marriage, Ovid was writing chapters like how to win her over at the races. You can probably guess how that ended. He got exiled. But we'll get to that. Flirting the Roman way of it believed that love could be taught, like archery or math. His advice was funny, bold, and sometimes wildly inappropriate, but it also gives us a glimpse into how Romans thought about romance, attraction, and the dance of desire. For example, Step 1. Location, location, location. If you want to find love, don't sit at home, go out. Theaters, baths, temples, the Circus Maximus, these were the hot spots. He even suggests pretending to be interested in the show just so you can sit close to someone and accidentally bump arms. The original fake popcorn reach. How to woo a Roman woman. According to Ovid, once you found your crush, the real game began. Ovid had some tips. Be confident, but not cocky. Compliment her, but don't be too obvious. A little mystery goes a long way. Write poetry. If you can't, just copy someone else's and hope she doesn't notice. Seriously, he said that. Be persistent, but playful. Don't beg, tease, charm, send little notes. And above all, don't get caught, especially if she's married, which, let's be honest, she probably was. It's important to remember, marriage in Rome didn't always mean monogamy. Affairs were common, just risky. Ovid's audience wasn't looking for soulmates. They were looking for fun. What about Women in Book 3 of Ars Amatoria. Ovid flips the script and gives seduction tips for women. This was shocking. Roman women were not supposed to pursue men, let alone be taught how to flirt. But Ovid encouraged them. He said women should wear flattering clothes, but not to flashy learn music, poetry, and conversation keep their skin soft and their breath fresh mint leaves. Anyone. Never reveal too much too soon. It's kind of like a Roman version of a fashion magazine crossed with a dating coach. Written in verse. Of course, Ovid's advice is full of stereotypes and double standards, but it's also one of the few surviving texts that even acknowledges female desire in Rome. That's something. Theater. Rome, stating a poem of the most common meeting spots for lovers in Rome was the theater. Not because of the shows. Most people couldn't even hear what was happening on stage, but because it was crowded, chaotic, and full of opportunity. Ovid practically turns the theater into a dating map. Sit near the aisle to scope out. The arrivals use the curtain drop as an excuse to talk if it starts raining. Offer your cloak. Instant hero points. He even says you can read someone's body language by how they laugh at the jokes. If they chuckle politely, go slow. If they snort, full speed ahead. It's charmingly weird, but also kind of sweet. Hair, hygiene, and aphrodisiacs. Believed attraction could be influenced by scent, style, and even potions. Aphrodisiacs were everywhere, from herbs and spices to weirder stuff like ground-up beetles and exotic fish sauces. We don't recommend those. Ovid told women to keep their breath fresh mint and myrrh, their arms smooth with pumice stone, and their hair elegant, but not too perfect. A little messiness was considered attractive, just rolled out, of a gilded bed vibes. And for men, just don't smell bad. That was the bar. Love spells, potions, and risky business. Romans didn't trust charm alone. Love magic was surprisingly common, carved into lead tablets and buried in graves, slipped into drinks, or whispered under the moon. A typical spell might say, "Let her burn with love, lose sleep, crave only me." Romantic? Maybe. Creepy. Definitely effective. Unclear. The important thing is that people believed in this stuff. Love wasn't just a game, it was a force, mysterious, dangerous, and worth a little black market spellwork. Ovid's downfall. Too flirty for his own good. No. All this fun had consequences. Emperor Augustus, the guy trying to promote family values and traditional marriage, was not amused by Ovid's work. The Ars Amatoria was seen as undermining the state's moral goals. In 08 CE, Augustus banished Ovid to the edge of the empire, to a cold, miserable town on the Black Sea. Ovid never returned. He spent the rest of his life writing sad poems about his exile, begging to come home. The official reason for his exile: a poem and a mistake. Scholars still argue about what that mistake was, but the poem, that was definitely the art of love, the romance that echoes. Even though Ovid's advice was cheeky, sometimes shallow, and full of bad boundaries, he captured something real: the excitement, awkwardness, and chaos of falling for someone, even into gas. And through his poetry, we see that Romans weren't so different. They got tongue-tied, they bragged too much, they read too far into every little gesture. In a way, Ovid's work reminds us that love, however silly, messy, or dramatic, is a very old, very human thing. Gods behaving badly, divine affairs, and mythical mischief. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. We've talked about how regular Romans flirted, dated, and misbehaved. But where did they get these ideas? Some of them came from religion, and, spoiler alert, Roman gods were not exactly role models. Tonight, were climbing up to Mount Olympus, or the Roman version of it, to peek into the divine drama that made soap operas look tame. We're talking about gods who couldn't keep their tunics on, goddesses with grudges, and magical transformations that were usually someone's very bad idea. So relax, close your eyes, and prepare for some ancient gossip straight from the heavens. Meet the Pantheon. Powerful, petty, and problematic Romans borrowed most of their gods from the Greeks and gave them Latin names. So Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Aphrodite became Venus, and so on. But just because they got new names didn't mean they got better behavior. These gods ruled over love, war, the weather, wine, and just about everything else, and they had all the powers in the universe, but they also had the emotional maturity of a tipsy teenager at a toga party. Jupiter, aka Zeus, king of the gods, and of bad decisions. Let's start with Jupiter, king of the gods. You'd think being in charge would come with some responsibility. Nope. Jupiter was famous, or infamous, for his love affairs. Mortal women, nymphs, goddesses, no one was safe. He had a long-suffering wife, Juno, but that didn't stop him from chasing anything with a pulse, and the disguises he used. Wild, a short list, a swan to seduce Leda, a golden shower of light to visit Dano, a bull to kidnap Europa, a cloud because. Sure's in each story, he shows up in some dramatic, magical form, woos or tricks the poor woman, and then vanishes. Often, she ends up pregnant, sometimes with twins, sometimes with demigods. It's less romantic and more mythical paternity court. Juno, the queen of clapbacks. No, you might wonder, what about Juno? She's Jupiter's wife, goddess of marriage and childbirth. Was she chill about all this? Absolutely not. Juno didn't go after her cheating husband. She went after the women he cheated with, and their kids. Even if the women were tricked, or kidnapped, or turned into cows. Yes, actual cows. Take the story of Io, a priestess Jupiter seduced. Juno found out, turned Io into a cow, and had her guarded by a 100-eyed monster named Argus. That's some intense revenge energy. And poor Hercules, Jupiter's half-mortal son. Juno hated him from the moment he was born. She sent snakes to his crib and later drove him temporarily insane. Tough love. Try mythological trauma. Venus, goddess of love, queen of choice. Next up is Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and all things steamy. You'd think she'd be the calm one. Nope. Venus was basically the divine matchmaker of Rome. She could make anyone fall in love, or completely lose their mind over someone. But she also got tangled in her own messes. Her most famous lover was Mars, the god of war, which, when you think about it, makes sense. Love and war, passion and chaos, always tangled together. The problem: Venus was married to Vulcan, the god of blacksmithing. He found out about the affair and literally built a magical net to catch them in the act. Then he invited the other gods to come look. That's ancient reality TV, right there. Mars, the hothead Mars, was the god of war, and basically a walking rage. Issue: he wasn't known for subtlety. When he wasn't fighting on battlefields or cheating with Venus, he was starting fights with other gods, mortals, or monsters. And yet, somehow, people loved him, soldiers prayed to him, and Rome even claimed him as their mythical dad. Yes, Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus, the twins raised by a she-wolf who eventually founded Rome, so technically, the whole city was founded by the offspring of a war god and a pharaoh babysitter. That explains a lot. Apollo and his smooth moves Apollo, god of the sun, music, and poetry, tried very hard to be charming. But his love stories usually ended badly, like Greek tragedy badly. He once fell for a woman named Daphne, who didn't return his feelings. So, what happened? She literally begged the gods to save her, and they turned her into a tree. Yes, a tree. Apollo still loved her. So he made a wreath out of her branches and wore it forever. Romantic, creepy, you decide. Another time, he chased a young man named Hyacinthus. This one was mutual. Finally, but during a game of discus, Apollo accidentally killed him. With the discus, ouch, from the drops of blood, a flower grew, the hyacinth. A very poetic ending to a very unfortunate date. Cupid, tiny, winged Chaosa. Cupid, the little winged baby with a bow and arrow. He looks cute. But don't be fooled. Cupid could make anyone fall in love with anyone, often just for the drama. Shoot one person with a love arrow and the other with a repel arrow, and boom, instant heartbreak comedy. His most famous story is with Psyche, a mortal woman he fell for. But their relationship was full of lies, tests, and magical trials. At one point, Psyche had to go to the underworld just to win him back. Lesson: never date someone who can fly and has magic arrows. It gets complicated. What did Romans think about all this? Surprisingly, Romans loved these stories. They didn't see the gods as perfect. In fact, their flaws made them more relatable. The myths weren't there to inspire good behavior. They were there to explain why life is messy. People cheated. So did Jupiter. Fell in love with the wrong person. Just ask Venus. Got turned into a cow. Okay, that one's less common, but you get the idea. The gods were mirrors. Chaotic, emotional, powerful mirrors of human life. They made mistakes, held grudges, and followed their passions, no matter the cost. So was it all just drama? Kind of, but there was meaning in it, too. The myths reminded Romans that love was a force, unpredictable, divine, and sometimes dangerous. You could fall into it, be cursed by it, or be transformed because of it. It was bigger than reason, bigger than rules, and sometimes it involved turning into a swan. Marriage, romance, and a shared bowl of garum. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. So far, we've wandered through the wild world of Roman seduction, brothels, gods behaving badly, and one poet who got exiled for giving love advice. But tonight, we're dialing it down a notch. Less passion, more paperwork, because we're talking about marriage. What did it mean to get married in ancient Rome? Was it romantic? Was it strategic? Did people actually love each other? Or was it all about property and politics? Well, it depends. So fluff your pillow and grab a cup of metaphorical wine, because tonight we're going to a Roman wedding. And like most weddings, it's going to be part ceremony, part family drama, and part awkward dancing. First of all, what even was a Roman marriage? There wasn't just one kind of marriage in Rome. There were actually a few different types, depending on class, time period, and how traditional your family was. The most formal kind was called confarreatio. And no, that's not a pasta dish. This was a religious wedding reserved for the upper classes. It involved priests, sacred bread, literally a spelt cake, and a very stiff vibe. The couple had to share this sacred bread as part of the ceremony, hence the name. Confarreatio, with spelt, and yes, if you're wondering, it's about as romantic as chewing dry toast in front of a crowd. Then there was usus, which was basically common law marriage. If you lived together for a year, without the woman spending 3 nights away from home. Boom. Married. No ceremony required, kind of like the ancient Roman version of just forgetting to break up. Who picked the spouse? In most Roman marriages, love had very little to do with it. Marriage was about family alliances, wealth, social climbing, and, most importantly, making legitimate Roman babies. Fathers usually arranged the match. Sometimes, the bride and groom hadn't even met before the wedding. And if that sounds awkward, remember, brides were often very young, like 12 to 14 years old. Grooms were typically older, 20s or 30s. Was that normal back then? Yes. Is it super weird now? Also yes. And no. The bride didn't get a say. Unless she had a very progressive family, or a lot of money, or was literally an emperor's daughter. The wedding day, togas, torches, and tears. A Roman wedding wasn't just one event. It was a series of rituals, signs, and very specific clothing choices. Here's a rough timeline of how it went. Auspices were taken, basically checking the birds for omens. If the birds said bad day, the wedding was rescheduled, because obviously birds know everything. The bride wore a long white tunic tied with a special knot of Hercules, symbolic of fertility, strength, and, well, a pretty tricky knot to untie. A flame-colored veil called a flamium was placed over her head. It looked more like a bright orange curtain than a bridal veil, but it made her look like a human torch, which was apparently the goal. The guests yelled feliciter. Basically good luck. Or yay. You did it. And then came the feast. And no Roman party was complete without garum, that infamous fermented fish sauce they poured on everything, including wedding food. Romance. The wedding night, let's just say. Expectations were high. The bride was usually very young and probably terrified. The groom was expected to be gentle, at least according to the poets, but most historical records don't spend much time on this part. They kind of fade to black. What we do know is that marriage in Rome wasn't about passion. That happened outside the marriage, if at all. Roman society assumed men would have mistresses, slaves, or visit brothels. Wives, they were expected to stay faithful. Double standard. Oh, absolutely. Married life, who wore the toga. Actually, only men wore togas. Respectable Roman women wore a garment called a stola, a long, draped dress that screamed, "I'm married and tired." Wives were expected to manage the household, raise the children, and be morally upright. That meant no public drama, no flirty poetry, and definitely no showing up at the baths alone. A good Roman wife was quiet, modest, and obedient. Of course, not all Roman women followed that rule. Some were powerful, wealthy, and wildly independent. But more on that in another chapter. Divorce. Surprisingly easy. Here's a twist. Roman divorce was very common and easy. You didn't need a court or a reason. Either spouse could just say, "We're done," and that was it. Property went back to the original families, and the bride returned her dowry. The rich and powerful married and divorced like it was a political sport. Emperor Augustus even forced people to marry and remarry to produce heirs. Love wasn't the goal. Alliances were. One Roman woman reportedly had 8 husbands. Another man had 20 wives. Honestly, it starts sounding more like ancient Rome, the dating show. But, was there any love? Yes. Surprisingly, yes. Despite all the politics and property deals, real love did exist. Some couples grew genuinely close. There are tombstones with sweet messages between spouses. Things like, "To my wife, who lived with me for 40 years without a quarrel. That's impressive in any century. And poets like Ovid, Propertius, and Catullus wrote about deep, messy, passionate love. Some wrote to their wives, others to lovers, courtesans, or imaginary muses. The point is, love happened, even if it wasn't required. Marriage and status. Know your rank. Marriage also depended a lot on class. Patricians, the elite, got married to stay rich, and powerful plebeians, middle and lower class, got married to build families and share labor. Slaves couldn't legally marry, but had informal unions called contubernum. Freed people, once freed, they could marry, but still face social limits. So yeah, love was complicated and legally limited. So, was Roman marriage just a business deal? A lot of the time? Yes, but within all those expectations and traditions, real affection could grow. Some marriages started cold and warmed up. Others started with a spark and fizzled. Just like today. What makes Roman love stories so interesting is how familiar they can feel. The fights, the compromise, the quiet joy of sharing a meal, even if it includes fermented fish sauce. Bad Girls of Rome, Scandal, Power, and Pleasure. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where the stories are quiet, the facts are spicy, and no one's judging you for nodding off halfway through. Tonight, we're meeting the women who refused to play nice in ancient Rome. See, Roman society expected women to be modest, obedient, quiet, basically, background characters in a world run by men. But some women didn't get the memo, or they read it and threw it into the nearest fire. These women weren't just breaking hearts, they were breaking rules. Some seduced emperors, others ran empires. Some just refused to sit still and be proper. So fluff your pillow, get cozy, and prepare to meet the scandalous ladies of Rome. They didn't always play fair, but they always made history. Messalina, the empress with a reputation. Let's start with Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. You'd think being empress would be enough excitement, but Messalina, she wanted more, according to Roman gossip. And boy, there was a lot, as she had a habit of sneaking out at night, disguising herself, and working in a brothel. Yes, while she was married to the emperor. Was that true? Maybe not. Roman historians loved exaggerating when it came to women in power, especially if they were disliked. But here's what we do know. She had multiple affairs. She married another man while still married to Claudius. She plotted political moves like a chess master with zero chill. Eventually, Claudius found out and had her executed. But even after her death, her legend lived on. Some saw her as a cautionary tale, others as a symbol of a woman who simply did whatever she pleased. Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. Yes, Cleopatra was technically Egyptian, but Rome was obsessed with her. She was smart, charming, multilingual, and politically ruthless, and she had the famous Roman lovers, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. To Romans, she was terrifying, a foreign queen who seduced their top generals. Scandal, outrage, secretly kind of hot. She wasn't just a pretty face, either. Cleopatra used her relationships to secure power, protect her kingdom, and challenge Rome's dominance. The Roman Senate absolutely hated her. The poets, secretly fascinated, and the public couldn't stop whispering about her eyeliner. Julia the Elder, party girl with a political bloodline. Next up, Julia the Elder, daughter of Emperor Augustus, raised in the spotlight, expected to be perfect, and very much not. Augustus tried to pass laws promoting moral behavior, like marriage, family, and sexual modesty, but his own daughter, She was rumored to be having affairs with half the Senate. According to some reports, she even picked lovers based on their looks and their political usefulness. If true, that's impressive multitasking. Eventually, Augustus had enough. He exiled her to a barren island with no wine. That's how serious this was. No wine. She died in exile, but her story stuck around, proof that even emperors' daughters weren't safe from double standards. Agrippina the Younger, the mother who made Emperor Ursa Agrippina, one of Rome's most powerful and feared women. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula, the wife of Emperor Claudius, and the mother of Emperor Nero, which means her family dinners were wild. Agrippina was ambitious. She wanted power, not just through her husbands or sons, but for herself, and she got it. She was deeply involved in politics, ran the palace like a CEO, and some say she even poisoned Claudius to make room for Nero. Once Nero became emperor, things got awkward. He didn't like how much influence she had, and she didn't like being sidelined. He tried to kill her. Multiple times. One time, he had a special boat built to collapse while she was on it. She swam away. Another time, assassins stabbed her, and she allegedly told them, "Strike the womb that bore Nero." Chilling. Clodia. The rebel poet's Musa Clodia was wealthy, witty, and sharp as a dagger. She was known for her poetry, her parties, and her scandals. She was married to a much older man, but that didn't stop her from living her best life. She had a rumored affair with the poet Catullus, who wrote her into his poems under the name Lesbia. Their relationship was messy, romantic poems, bitter breakups, jealous rants, basically, ancient Instagram drama. She also got involved in politics, lawsuits, and public debates. One famous orator, Cicero, called her the Medea of the Palatine, basically accusing her of being a dangerous seductress. Did she care? Not really. Poppaea Sabina, beauty and brains and ambition. Poppaea was a woman who knew how to climb the Roman social ladder. One carefully planned step at a time. She started as a noble woman, married a few powerful men, and eventually became the wife of Emperor Nero. She was known for her beauty, but also for her influence. Nero adored her, some say too much. He even divorced his first wife just to be with Poppaea, but the story takes a dark turn. Some sources claim he killed her in a fit of rage while she was pregnant. Others say she died of illness. Either way, Nero later had her body embalmed in spices and gave her a state funeral. Clearly, he had feelings. Roman society reacts. Applause and outrageous women were famous, or infamous, depending on who you asked. To some, they were monsters. To others, they were legends. The historians, who were mostly men, painted them as dangerous, lustful, manipulative. But the fact that they could stir the pot and grab power in such a rigid society, that says something. They were living proof that, even in ancient Rome, where laws and traditions tried to cage women in, some still found ways to bend or break the rules. Double standards. Always. Let's not pretend ancient Rome was fair. Men could do almost anything, sleep around, chase power, make mistakes, and still be praised. Women. One scandal, and you were immoral, too, and you were exiled or poisoned. But that's why these stories matter, because even in a world stacked against them, these women left their mark. Through politics, seduction, rebellion, or sheer force of will, they were the exceptions, the ones who dared love beyond the norm. Gender, identity, and same-sex relationships in Rome. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where the candles are low, the stories are honest, and sometimes The Romans get a little complicated tonight. We're stepping away from emperors and empresses, scandals and marriages, and focusing on a part of Roman society that doesn't always get the spotlight: same-sex relationships, gender identity, and everything in between, because for all the rules and roles the Romans claimed to live by, love and desire didn't always follow the script. So snuggle into your blanket, silence the judgment of long-dead senators, and let's meet the lovers, partners, and rebels who didn't quite fit the Roman mold and didn't care. Roman sexuality. It's not what you think. Let's start with something important. Romans didn't see sexuality the way we do today. They didn't have neat categories like straight or gay. Instead, they cared more about power, who was active and who was passive in a relationship. To a Roman man, having sex with another man wasn't necessarily seen as homosexual as long as he was the one in control. Being the dominant partner was considered fine, especially if the other person was a lower status man, like a slave or a foreigner. But if you were a Roman citizen and you took the passive role, that was a big social no-no. You'd be mocked, insulted, even seen as weak or unmanly. So yeah, complicated. Famous lovers. The emperors who loved men. Some of the most powerful men in Rome didn't hide their relationships with other men. They flaunted them. Julius Caesar, rumor had it that Caesar had a relationship with King Nicomedes of Bithynia when he was a young man. His enemies loved to mock him for it. They called him the Queen of Bithynia. Did he care? Not really. He still became dictator of Rome. So, haters gonna hate. Emperor Hadrian. This one is well documented. Hadrian deeply loved a young Greek man named Antinous. They traveled together, hunted together, and, according to most historians, were romantically involved. When Antinous tragically died, possibly by drowning in the Nile, Hadrian was devastated. He had statues made in his honor, named cities after him, and even had him declared a god. That's not just romance. That's divine-level devotion. Lesbians in the shadows. Unfortunately, we have far fewer records about relationships between women in ancient Rome, partly because Roman historians didn't care to write about it, partly because female sexuality was heavily controlled and rarely discussed, but we know it existed. The poet Sulpicia, one of the only female poets whose work survives, wrote openly about love and desire, and while her surviving poems mention men, they still reflect a female voice unafraid of passion. There are also scattered references in Roman law and literature to women being punished for having relations with other women, usually framed as deviant or unnatural. But if it was mentioned, that means it was happening. As always, history doesn't record what didn't exist, just what powerful people thought was worth writing down. Gender outside the binary. Romans weren't big on labels, but they did recognize that not everyone fit into the neat box of male or female. There were mentions of people with ambiguous gender identity in Roman texts. They sometimes called them senidi or androgyny, terms that were often used insultingly, but still showed that the concept existed. Some priests in certain Eastern cults, like the followers of Cybele, would castrate themselves and wear women's clothing. The Romans were scandalized by this, but it happened. And these individuals often lived on the edges of Roman society, both respected and ridiculed. So while ancient Rome didn't have words like transgender, they did have people who lived beyond the expected norms of gender and paid the price or carved out space anyway. Laws, morals, and hypocrisy was full of contradictions. On one hand, there were poems, love letters, and art that celebrated same-sex attraction. On the other hand, there were strict moral laws that tried to control behavior, especially among the upper classes. Emperor Augustus passed laws encouraging marriage and childbearing, and discouraging immoral acts, including same-sex relationships among freeborn citizens. But let's be honest, those laws didn't stop much. People still did what they wanted. They just got sneakier about it. Slaves and lower-class Romans were especially vulnerable. Their relationships, same-sex or otherwise, were rarely recorded and often ignored, but that doesn't mean they weren't real. Art, poetry, and subtle clues. If you want to find same-sex love in ancient Rome, you have to look between the lines, and sometimes at the walls. Roman art and graffiti show men with other men, women embracing women, and cheeky drawings that leave very little to the imagination. These weren't always considered romantic in the modern sense, but they were part of everyday life. Poets like Martial and Juvenal wrote openly and often mockingly about male-male relationships, and others, like Catullus, played with desire in ways that didn't stick to neat gender roles. Their words were messy, playful, sometimes mean, but also very human. So, was it love? Yes, not always, not everywhere, but yes. Among the satire, judgment, and double standards, we still find evidence of real affection. Hadrian's grief for Antinous was genuine. Julius Caesar's relationship shaped his reputation. Countless unnamed lovers, citizens, slaves, poets, artists, found ways to express themselves. Even if history didn't remember their names, love didn't care about labels. It happened in quiet corners, whispered poems, secret meetings, and public devotion. The dark side, exploitation, consent, and power in Roman sexual culture. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. You're safe here. The stories are soft-spoken, but tonight's topic, not so soft. We've spent a few chapters looking at love, scandal, romance, even rebellion. But now it's time to talk about what happened when sex in Rome wasn't about love, or even choice. Because for all their art and poetry, ancient Romans built a world that ran on power, and that included power over people's bodies. So get comfortable. Keep your eyes half closed if you like. This isn't a sexy chapter, but it's an important one. Consent. Not exactly. Let's get one thing clear. The Romans didn't have a word for consent the way we think of it today. Their laws didn't ask, was this person willing? Instead, they asked, was this person a citizen or a slave? Were they male or female? Were they in power or owned by someone else? In Roman society, power decided who could say yes, and more often, who couldn't say no. Slavery and the lack of bodily autonomy. There were millions of slaves in ancient Rome, and they had no legal protection over their own bodies. If you were a slave, your owner could force you to have sex, sell your body to others, punish you for refusing profit from your exploitation. There were entire slave markets just for bodies, not for labor, but for sex. Some slaves were trained for this. Some were bought only for this. Even children weren't protected. That part's hard to say, but it's true. In a system built on ownership, people of all ages were treated as property. And remember, this was seen as normal. No one was writing heartfelt essays about human rights in the Forum. That idea hadn't arrived yet. The role of status, who got protected. Freeborn Roman citizens had some legal protections, especially if they were male and wealthy. If a high-status man was assaulted, that was a crime. But if a slave was assaulted, that was considered damage to someone's property, not a crime against a person, like scratching someone's chariot. Even free women had very limited protection. A woman's body was often seen as the property of her father or husband. If she was violated, The real legal concern was often, has this affected her value? It's awful, but that's how the system worked. Brothels and the business of exploitation Rome had a thriving sex trade. Brothels were common, often small and hidden in alleyways, with carved symbols over the doors and crude paintings on the walls. Many of the workers were enslaved people. They didn't choose the work. They were bought, branded, and used. Some brothels were legal, others underground. Either way, the city looked the other way, or looked with interest. Clients could include soldiers, senators, even emperors. Some of these brothels catered to men seeking women. Others catered to men seeking men. Some catered to both. None of it involved true consent. It was a system, and it was brutal, public. Shame, private violence. The only strange twist. In Rome, the clients were usually not shamed, but the victims could be. If someone, especially a man, was seen as passive in a sexual act, even if it wasn't their choice, they could be mocked or ostracized. Roman poets wrote cruel verses mocking people for being used. Political enemies accused each other of being weak because of what others did to them, even if it wasn't consensual. Imagine surviving something traumatic and then having it turned into a punchline. That was real for many people in ancient Rome. Laws about morality. For the wrong people, Rome had morality laws, especially under Augustus, who wanted to clean up society. But those laws focused on women's behavior, not on protecting people from abuse. For example, women caught committing adultery could be exiled or even killed. Men could do pretty much whatever they wanted, as long as they weren't caught doing it with someone socially equal in the wrong role. In other words, morality laws weren't about kindness or consent. They were about control. The silent story shares something to remember. We have very little record of how victims felt. Almost all Roman writing comes from rich men, senators, poets, historians, not the people who suffered. We don't have journals from enslaved people. We don't have letters from abused women. We don't have testimonials from those used in brothels or households, but we know they existed. We know they were there, in the background of every grand villa and banquet, and we know what systems like this do to people. So sometimes, honoring history means naming the silence and remembering the people whose voices were never written down. Was there any hope? Yes. In small ways, some enslaved people eventually gained freedom. Some brothel workers escaped or aged out. Some women found ways to fight back, quietly or not. And Roman literature, as harsh as it could be, sometimes showed glimpses of tenderness. A poet mourning a lost love, a husband praising his wife, a master who fell for the person he once owned and chose to free them. Small things, imperfect, but real. It wasn't enough to fix the system, but it reminds us that even in the harshest times, people still searched for love and kindness. Baths, boudoirs, and bedroom rituals, the intimate routines of ancient Rome. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. You made it through the dark stuff, and now we're drawing a warm bath, lighting a little oil lamp, and slipping into something historical. Tonight, we're not talking about scandal. We're talking about rituals, routines, clean skin, soft sheets, and maybe a little perfume behind the ear, because in ancient Rome, preparing for intimacy was an art, one that started long before anyone hit the bedroom. So get cozy. Maybe imagine you're wrapped in a soft linen robe. Let's step into the Roman boudoir, and yes, we'll be peeking behind a few curtains. Baths before bed. If you lived in ancient Rome, chances are you didn't bathe at home. You went to the public baths, and not just to get clean. Bathing was a full-blown event, like going to the gym, a coffee shop, and a spa all rolled into one. You'd walk in, maybe say hi to your favorite masseuse, and move through a series of rooms: tepidarium, warm room; caldarium, hot steam room; frigidarium, cold plunge. You'd sweat, soak, chat, maybe flirt a little. Slaves would rub you down with oil, then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Yes, you were basically being oiled and squeeged. And after all that, you were clean, shiny, relaxed, and probably ready for some pillow talk. Hair, perfume, and pre-bedtime promens took appearance seriously, especially before a romantic encounter. Hair was a big deal. Women curled it, pinned it, braided it; men oiled it, trimmed it, sometimes dyed it if they were feeling spicy. And body hair, let's just say smooth, was in. Wealthy Romans often had their legs, arms, and even underarms plucked or scraped clean. Perfume was everywhere. Imported from Arabia or Egypt, it came in little glass bottles with names like nardum or myrrha. You dab it behind your ears, on your wrists, maybe even in your hair. No deodorant yet, but lots of effort to smell like something other than a street full of donkeys. Bedroom vibes, mood lighting, and a corno. Let's step into the actual Roman bedroom, or as they called it, the cubiculum. It wasn't huge, but it was cozy. Stone or wood walls, maybe a fresco or two, a bronze lamp flickering in the corner. The bed, usually just a wooden frame with ropes and a mattress stuffed with straw or feathers, was the centerpiece. Wealthier Romans had softer beds, silk sheets, and embroidered pillows. Others made do with wool blankets and simple linens. Some bedrooms had mirrors, made of polished bronze or silver. Not the clearest reflection, but enough to check your hair or admire your profile mid-flirt. And yes, some people had statues of Venus in their rooms, just in case they needed divine inspiration. The foods of romance: want to impress someone Roman style, feed them something sexy. Oysters were a favorite, so were figs, honey, and dates. Anything sweet and juicy that could be eaten slowly, preferably while lounging. Wine was a must, but not too strong. Romans usually watered their wine down. Getting too drunk wasn't classy, especially if you were trying to be seductive and not just fall off your couch. And here's a weird one: lettuce. Romans thought it helped calm passion after the act, like a post-romance salad. Can't say that one caught on. Dirty poetry and pillow talk before Netflix and chill. There was Ovid. He wrote steamy, funny poetry full of flirtation and double meanings. His Art of Love was basically an ancient pickup guide. He wrote things like, "She wants to be asked. She wants to say no. And then yes. If you ask again, okay." Maybe don't take all his advice, but the point is, words mattered. Pillow talk was alive and well. Lovers whispered poetry, recited lines they'd memorized, quoted plays, made up new verses. It wasn't all physical. There was wit, charm, and sometimes genuine tenderness. Role play, games, and a little fun. Romans liked a bit of spice in the bedroom. Not that kind of spice. Okay, sometimes that too. But imagination. Costumes weren't just for the stage. Sometimes lovers dressed up as gods or goddesses. Venus and Mars, maybe, or a noble and a servant. Or thus put on something sheer and mysterious. Dice games were also common. You could roll for kisses, or dares, or positions, all in good fun. And don't forget the amulets. Some people wore charms believed to bring passion, stamina, or fertility. Superstition met seduction. Not always privateer something awkward. Bedrooms weren't always private. In wealthy homes, you might have servants just outside or inside the room. In poorer homes, the bed might be right next to your grandmother's curtain. Walls were thin, privacy was rare. If you had something going on after dark, chances are someone else knew about it. That's why so many love poems talk about sneaking, whispering, tiptoeing, and trying not to knock over a candle on the way out. After the act, rituals and superstitions saved her the fun. They were rituals. Some were about hygiene, some were symbolic, some were just odd. Many people believed in cleansing the body after sex, not just with water, but with special oils or herbs. They were also small prayers to Venus or Fortuna, to say thank you, to ask for more good luck, or maybe to avoid pregnancy. The Roman birth control was, let's just say, inconsistent. Some couples shared a drink, some shared a story. Some just rolled over and started snoring. Because, hey, even in ancient Rome, some things never change. The decline of desire. How Roman sexual culture changed over time. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, the wine's a little watered down. The poetry books are closed. The silk sheets have been folded and put away, because something's changing in ancient Rome. The passion is still there, somewhere, but it's being boxed up, censored, and slowly buried under the weight of empire, morality, and a very serious group of early Christians. So take a deep breath, get comfy, let's drift gently into the quieter end of Rome's long, complicated love story. The party slows down. Earlier in this series, we saw the Romans living it up. Parties, brothels, flirty poetry, steamy bathhouses, even cheeky graffiti. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the mood had started to change. The empire was struggling, politically unstable, economically shaky, threatened by invasions, and in times of chaos, people often reach for order. That meant stricter rules, tighter control, and a growing suspicion of things like sensual pleasure. Emperors. Get serious, some of the later Roman emperors really wanted to be seen as morally upright, and that meant pushing back against the wild days of old Rome. Take Emperor Constantine, for example. In the early 300s, he did something big. He converted to Christianity. Now, this didn't instantly turn Rome into a choir of monks, but it did signal a shift. Christianity was no longer just a fringe movement, it was becoming the empire's new moral compass, and it had very different ideas about sex. Christianity arrives with a blanket. Christian leaders in Rome didn't hate sex, they just wanted it organized, married, private, purposeful, the old Roman idea of pleasure for pleasure's sake. That was seen as temptation, a distraction, something to be managed, or even avoided. Bishops began preaching about chastity, modesty, and sin, and they were taken seriously. Over time, their views started shaping laws and daily life. Adultery was punished more harshly, prostitution was frowned upon, but still common. Public nudity, even in bathhouses, became taboorum, once full of saucy poetry and cheeky frescoes, was tightening its belt. Art begins to cover up. Earlier Roman art didn't shy away from nudity. Bodies were celebrated, strong, curvy, beautiful, human, but as Christian influence grew, statues started getting fig leaves literally, and paintings became more symbolic, less sensual. Even the goddess Venus, once the queen of love and beauty, started showing up less and less in popular art. It was like someone dimmed the lights and turned down the volume on desire. Literature changes. Remember Ovid, our flirty poet from earlier chapters. By the late Roman period, nobody was writing like that anymore. Instead, Writers were focused on spiritual battles, moral struggles, and avoiding the sins of the flesh. Sex became something to confess, not celebrate. People like Augustine of Hippo wrote about resisting temptation and feeling guilty for their desires. His famous book, Confessions, is basically one long spiritual diary and a key document in the rise of Christian thought about the body and the soul. Spoiler alert. He had a lot of regrets. Women and the virgin ideally Roman culture had complex, sometimes contradictory ideas about women, but at least women could be flirted with, desired, praised in poems. By the late Empire, the Virgin Mary was becoming the new ideal. Not just religiously, culturally. Women were encouraged to be modest, quiet, faithful, and, if possible, virgins. Celibacy became noble. Even within marriage, too much passion was seen as suspicious. Sure, people still had sex, but talking about it, writing about it, that was increasingly off limits. Brothels still buzzed. Quietly, despite all the new rules, the sex industry didn't disappear. Prostitution still existed. Secret affairs still happened. Some people still lived wild lives, just more quietly, but socially, publicly, the approval was gone. What once had been out in the open, paintings, performances, parties, now lived in the shadows. Rome hadn't lost its desire. It had just been told to hide it. Laws tighten around the bedroom. Here's a fun fact that isn't fun. In the late Roman Empire, some emperors passed laws about who could have sex, when, and why. Some examples: restrictions on divorce. It became harder to leave an unhappy marriage. Rules about remarriage. Punishments for immoral behavior, even between consenting adults. Basically, the bedroom had become another part of the empire to govern. The rise of monastic life. As the Roman world moved into the early medieval period, a new type of hero emerged, not the general or gladiator, but the monk. Monks and nuns gave up all worldly pleasures, including sex, to live lives of prayer, silence, and service. To many, these figures were spiritual role models. To others, they were reminders that desire was something to be denied, not enjoyed. This was a huge shift from the Rome of a few centuries earlier, where even the gods had flings and the walls had love poems. Desire didn't die, but it got quiet. Even in this new world of sermons and saints, desire didn't disappear. It just went underground. People still loved, still longed, still whispered, but it was no longer a public performance. It became private, personal, sometimes shameful, and that's one of the biggest changes in Roman history. Not just the fall of an empire, but the fall of a feeling, a cooling off of a once fiery cultural flame. Echoes of Rome: how Roman sexual ideas lingered through the ages. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're not in the heart of ancient Rome anymore. The statues are chipped, the bathhouses are cold, the poets have gone quiet, but Rome ain't really gone. Not completely, because empires leave footprints, and Roman ideas about sex, beauty, gender, and desire, they've been echoing through time like a soft voice in a marble hallway. So fluff your pillow. Let's drift gently through the centuries and see just how much of ancient Roman romance survived the fall, but not the forgetting hen. The Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 CE. It wasn't like someone turned off a switch. People didn't suddenly stop wearing togas and start quoting monks. It was a slow fade. Roman culture melted into what became medieval Europe, and some Roman ideas stuck around, even if they were reshaped. Sex, still happening, of course, but now it came with more rules, more guilt, less poetry. But the old Roman ideas, they didn't vanish. They just slipped into new clothes, medieval Rome, what stayed, what went in the early Middle Ages. Christian writers were trying to distance themselves from Roman indulgence, but deep down, they were still living in Rome's long shadow. Some old Roman books survived in monasteries, quietly copied, tucked away, whispered about, and some Roman customs, like arranged marriages, dowries, or class-based gender roles, kept going, even under Christian rule. It's like Rome had left its fingerprints on every page, even the ones rewritten by priests. Renaissance. The Roman Revival. No, we jump ahead to the 15th and 16th centuries, to the Renaissance, when European thinkers, artists, and scholars looked back at Rome and said, "You know what? Maybe they had a point." Suddenly, Roman statues were being dug up and admired. Ancient texts were translated. Poets were quoting Ovid again, and painters were filling their canvases with curvy goddesses and flirty nymphs. People even started designing buildings to look Roman: domes, columns, arches, and a little sensuality here and there. The Renaissance didn't just bring back science and art, it brought back desire. Ovid's big comeback. Remember Ovid, the cheeky Roman poet. He made a big comeback in the Renaissance. His art of love was reprinted, translated, and passed around by people who probably pretended to read it just for the Latin. Artists painted scenes from his poems, especially the steamier ones. Scholars wrote commentaries on his metaphors. Lovers scribbled his verses into letters. Ovid was basically the ancient version of a popular romantic playlist. The churches pushed back off course. Not everyone was thrilled about all this Roman revival stuff. The Catholic Church, still powerful, still cautious, pushed back. It was fine to study Roman philosophy, but Roman sensuality, that was dangerous. Books were censored. Art was covered up. Some of the same texts that were praised in one century got banned in the next. It was a tug-of-war between curiosity and control, between Venus and the Virgin Mary. Victorian echoes, hiding in plain sight. Fast forward to the 1800s, the Victorian era in England and parts of Europe, a time known for tight corsets, buttoned-up morals, and lots of awkward silences. But even then, Roman ideas about sex were still hanging around. Rich families decorated their homes with statues of Venus. Museums displayed ancient Roman frescoes, just tasteful enough to avoid scandal. And educated folks still read Latin poetry, sometimes blushing, sometimes pretending they didn't notice the naughty parts. It was a strange mix, pretending to be proper, while quietly admiring a world that had been anything but. Roman gender norms, still lingering. Let's talk gender. Ancient Rome had clear ideas about who should do what: a men as the active, dominant figures, women as passive, modest, and quiet. In theory, at least, those roles stuck around for centuries. Even today, some of those old Roman expectations show up in how we talk about relationships, marriage, even fashion. It's like we're all still living with echoes of the toga, language that lingers. A fun fact: the way we talk about sex still carries some Roman flavor. Words like venereal, as in venereal disease, come from Venus. Libido is from Latin, meaning desire. Even the word romance, yep, tied to Rome. Our very language still hums with Roman history, even if we don't realize it. Roman myths in modern media. On a movie, open a novel, you'll find Roman myths everywhere. Gods falling in love and troubled warriors with complicated romantic lives, beautiful people lounging in silk robes and drinking wine from golden cups. From historical dramas to modern rom-coms, the Roman legacy of mixing power, love, and scandal still sells. It's comforting to know that 2,000 years later, we're still telling the same stories, just with better lighting and less lead poisoning. Bodies. Still beautiful on last whisper from the past. The Roman idea that bodies are worth admiring. Not just for utility, not just for modesty, but for beauty, for art, for joy, even through all the centuries of shame, rules, and repression. That idea never fully died. It still flickers in paintings, in sculpture, in selfies, in the way we look at each other, sometimes, and say, "You're beautiful," just like a statue. A soft goodbye from ancient Rome. Welcome back, one last time, to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're not here to learn something new. Not really. We're here to say goodbye. To the gods with jealous hearts, to the poets with ink-stained fingers, to the bathhouses, the bedrooms, the letters never sent, the statues frozen in longing, to ancient Rome, not the war-torn empire, but the place where people loved, laughed, touched, desired, just like us. So take a deep breath. Close your eyes if you want. Let's wrap this up gently. A story bigger than facts. We've spent a lot of time wandering through Roman bedrooms and reading their graffiti. We talked about emperors and empresses, gods and mortals, poets and prostitutes. But underneath all of that, this has always been a story about being human. Rome may have had strange customs, odd laws, and dramatic myths, but at its heart, it was full of people trying to figure out the same things we are. What is love? What does beauty mean? How much is too much? Why do we want what we want? They didn't always get it right. In fact, they often got it wildly wrong, but they tried, and honestly, that's kind of comforting. From walls to whispers. At the beginning of this series, we looked at graffiti, cheeky, bold little notes scribbled on ancient walls. Now, at the end, we're left with quieter echoes, whispers in dusty scrolls, faded frescoes, a broken statue that still holds a certain look. Rome went from a loud, unapologetic celebration of desire to something softer, more hidden, more restrained. And then it passed that torch, carefully, quietly, to the rest of the world. Even now, when we talk about love, sex, shame, beauty, power, and connection, we're still answering questions they asked 2,000 years ago. We didn't cover everything, and that's okay. Let's be honest. There's no way to fully capture ancient Roman sexuality in 15 bedtime chapters. We didn't dive into every emperor's scandal, or every strange ritual, or every philosophical take. We didn't translate every Latin poem or decode every fresco, but we covered the spirit of it. We felt the rhythm, the tension between body and soul, between freedom and control, between public performance and private longing. And that's enough. That's more than enough to carry with you into dreamland. Rome was complicated, like you so madams. Roman culture celebrated sex with wild joy. Other times, it regulated it with harsh laws. It lifted up pleasure, and then tried to bury it. It praised gods of fertility, and then punished real people for acting on desire. It was full of contradictions. So are we. That's what makes history such a mirror. We don't just study the past, we see ourselves in it. Our questions, our confusion, our fears and hopes, they were all there. Thank you for listening. Before we wrap this up, just a quiet thank you from me to you. Thank you for taking this odd, beautiful little journey through ancient intimacy. For staying curious, even when the topic got weird or messy. For making space in your evening for old stories and soft history. There's something gentle about looking back, about saying, I wonder what they felt, instead of, I wonder what they conquered. And that's the heart of Boring History for Sleep. not to lull you with facts, but to remind you that even in marble and ruins, there was always warmth. Let the empire sleep, so now we tuck in the sheets. Blow out the oil lamp, fold up the toga. The empire is quiet now. The poets have stopped writing. The lovers are long gone, but their voices still hum through time, not in words, but in us. In the way we flirt, the way we ache, the way we search, not just for connection, but for meaning. Rome might be dust, but desire never really dies. One last echoes you. Fall asleep tonight. Remember this. The past isn't just a place with battles and borders. It's a diary, a love letter, a sigh. Somewhere under ancient skies, someone once whispered a name in the dark, and that moment, that feeling, echoes. Still. Sleep well, traveler. The road behind you is long. The stars above you are ancient, and history is always more tender than it seems.